Notwithstanding the court's efforts to change the juvenile justice system to some degree, the due process decisions in combination shifted the focus of delinquency proceedings, that we're no longer focusing initially on the best interests of the child, but now the question initially is legal guilt, right? It shifts the focus from needs to deeds, from the best interests to the question, did this kid commit the crime, as the prelude to issues of disposition and sentencing. The Supreme Court, by institutionalizing the adversarial model in the juvenile justice system, also made explicit the relationship between the commission of a crime and the sanctions that are going to be imposed, and made explicit the criminal law foundations of the juvenile justice system. And, sort of the irony is that the Supreme Court was really trying to do the right thing. They were trying to provide some justice for kids, and it's unfortunate that the delivery of procedural safeguards in the juvenile justice system ultimately has had the effect of legitimating punishment in the juvenile justice system, and that punishment now falls disproportionately heavily on the minority kids that the Supreme Court was originally trying to protect from the imposition of the state. Now, that sort of gets me to moving on to the next part of the story, because during the 1960s, not only did we have the rights revolution and the criminal procedure revolution, but it also coincided with the baby boom run-up in crime. Folks like me coming of age in the 60s and, really sort of feeling our oats. And it also coincided with the urban race riots in the 1960s. And it also coincided with what we know today as judicial activism, because once the courts were trying to deal with issues of racial disparity, it turned out there was a lot of racial disparity in America, that we had to deal with issues of welfare because blacks had traditionally been excluded from access to welfare rolls. The courts began ordering busing to desegregate schools. They began issuing orders to desegregate public housing. They began issuing orders to deal with issues of access to employment and affirmative action. They began dealing with issues of reproductive rights. So that there was an enormous amount of activity going on in the 60s, some of which were pitting the interests of blacks against white, working class, ethnic folks. But in combination, the Warren Court and Lyndon Johnson came to be identified with liberalism and ultimately with the Democratic Party. And, and it's really sort of, I sort of go through this history because it's sort of recent history. Or for me, it's my childhood. But it's recent history because up until the 1960s, there wasn't much difference between Democrats and Republicans about issues of race. They were attracting about equal numbers of black voters. I mean, there really wasn't any particular perception that there are differences between political parties about issues of race. But those began changing in the 1960s around the Supreme Court's decision and Johnson's legislative agenda, and also the race riots of the 1960s, the Harlem riot of '64, the Watts riot of '65, the 38 riots in '66 and the 164 riots in '67. I remember painting my apartment in Philadelphia when I was in college there, sort of with the smoke drifting down from North Philadelphia. And it was against that backdrop that there was the real perception that the world was going to hell. It was really going to hell because of crime, because of riots and the like. So Johnson appointed the National Advisory Committee on Urban Disorders, the Kerner Commission. And the Kerner Commission came back with its report in '68 that said that America was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And the Kerner Commission warned that to continue present policies was to make permanent the divisions of our country into two societies, one largely Negro and poor, located in central cities, the other predominantly white and affluent, located in the suburbs. And basically what we have seen for the past 3 decades has been the realization of the Kerner Commission's predictions. Because when the Kerner Commission was looking at these issues, it was really seeing these issues in structural terms, that the riots were about an historic pattern of discrimination and exclusion and oppression, and needed social structural changes. And that was sort of the intellectual impetus for the war on poverty, to provide that sort of social structural change. But there's an alternative way of framing all of these public policy issues, and that's to say, rather than thinking about it in social structural terms, we can think about it in individual terms, that these are just bad people making bad choices. And if bad people make bad choices, we respond to them individually rather than structurally and collectively. And in the competition for these two alternative frames of public policy, we had the riots of the 1960s, the rise of the Black Power movement supplanting the Martin Luther Kings of the 1960s, the baby boom increase in crime in the 1960s, the rise in welfare and the expansion of welfare rolls to now include blacks in the 1960s, rising rates of illegitimacy, and the real perception, as I said earlier, that the world was going to hell. And the white middle class felt very threatened, and that provided the framework for the backlash. Progressive criminology dominated American public policy up until the 1960s. And, you know, progressive criminology was this rehabilitative, indeterminate, individualized, discretionary way of dealing with issues of criminal justice. And perhaps most remarkably, criminology and criminal justice policy were seen primarily as issues for experts. It wasn't a political issue. It was really something that experts dealt with in the quiet of courtrooms and in the quiet of correctional offices, but it wasn't political. It only became political as part of the politics of rights of the 1960s and the emergence in the 1970s, where we saw the shift from rehabilitation to just deserts, and from the liberal critique of discretion as a form of discrimination, and the conservative concern about law and order, and an emphasis on a reduced social welfare role. And these two forces came together to undermine traditional support for the progressive conception of criminal justice administration. Now, the problem for liberals was once they've critiqued rehabilitation, they lacked a coherent alternative as a way to respond to conservative proposals to crack down on crime by focusing on those bad individuals making bad choices. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, a number of other structural changes began to occur that were ultimately going to get played out in the context of criminal justice policies. We saw the structural transformation of cities beginning in the 1970s and the 1980s, and the shift from a manufacturing to a service economy. That structural transformation of cities, in turn, was associated with the deindustrialization of the urban core, and deindustrialization, in turn, was associated with the emergence of the black underclass. It was in the context of the emergence of the black underclass in the deindustrialized urban cities of the transforming economy that crack cocaine reared its ugly head in the mid-1980s, and crack, in turn, was associated with the increase in black youth homicide, fueled by the availability of guns as part of the drug industry of the 1980s and the early 1990s. And media coverage of all of this fueled a public panic, as we saw the drive-by shootings and the escalations in youth homicide. And politicians exploited this public panic for electoral advantage, and in exploiting it, they talked about cracking down on youth crime, and cracking down and youth crime both became code words for talking about black males. And this ultimately led to the changes in juvenile justice waiver policies and changes in juvenile sentencing policies that have led us to the punitive juvenile justice system we know and enjoy today, with the shift in focus from concern about offenders to an emphasis on the offense, and from concerns about rehabilitation primarily to issues of retribution.